That happens every day, I think, around this time. Okay, getting back to where we are. So unlike the previous example, ethnicity, where the number just reflected a label, unlike the second example, where the number reflected order, here the number you assign to a person reflects also distance. Two people whose body mass index differ by a unit are 1 unit apart on that particular scale. So here the numbers represent order but also distance. And that's going to be important because the way we measure these things, here's some questions to think about. If you had a bunch of people using, and you're measuring their ethnicity scale, let's go back to the first example. Let's suppose I ask each of you to choose or to report which of these categories you fall into. Everyone who considers themselves of the Japanese ethnicity category was coded as a 1. Everyone who was a Caucasian was coded as a 2. So we have many people probably recording themselves as 3, some as 2, some as 1s or 4s. The question now to ask yourselves is, how would you summarize that distribution of race ethnicity categories? You have a number assigned to each person. The number is linked to the particular ethnic group. But can you add those numbers together, figure out what the average ethnicity level is? And I suspect most of you are shaking your head, hopefully, saying it makes no sense to take a person, go back one more slide, who answers 3, and another person who answers this is a 2. But the number 3 and the number 1, if you add them together and divide by 2, in other words, if you average those numbers together, does come up to equal the number 2. But that calculation makes no sense for this type of question. The best thing you can do here is just give me the proportion of people who express themselves to be of the Japanese ethnicity category, the proportion of people who said they were of the Hawaiian ethnicity category. So for this type of measurement, the only thing you could really do is to report the proportion of people who fall into each of those categories. On the other hand, if we look at the next question, if I ask you to report how people would respond to this question, if I ask each of you to give me a number 1 to 5 that reflects whether your health is excellent, very good, good, fair, or poor, then the question is, how would you summarize those numbers in a group of people like yourselves? Well, we could still say how many people, what proportion of people said 5, what proportion of people said 2. We can still do proportions. We could do one more thing here. We could ask everybody to line up against a wall. Put all the people who answered a 1 at the bottom of the line. Then all the people who answered 2 next to them, all the people who answered 3 next to them, 4 next to them, and 5 next to them. We could order the people by these responses. If there were 41 people along the line, we could find out who is the 21st person in that line. That's the person who has 20 people in front of him, people with better health, 20 people behind him, people with worse health. So he's the middle person in this line. So we could ask them, what did you answer to the question about your health status? If he answered a 3, that means 3 is the middle response, what we call the median. So whenever we have responses that reflect order, we could calculate a number, a median, to describe what the middle response would be. We could do that for the answers to the stages of change questions also. But if you had a body mass index, you could go one step further. The numbers reflect order. You could line people up against the wall by their body mass index and find the person in the middle of the line, find that person's body mass index, that would be the median. Now you could also do a calculation. You could calculate the average, because now the numbers not only reflect order, but they also reflect distances between those peoples with different body mass index. So depending what the type of measurement you have, for the first question, for the ethnicity, you'd probably just report proportions. For the stages of change, you'd probably report medians. For the quality of life, you'd probably report medians. For the body mass index, you'd probably report averages. So what I have here is basically a distinction between different types of measurements: nominal measurements, ordinal measurements, and continuous measurements. A nominal measurement means the number you assign to a person is just a label for a category. There's no order intended by those numbers because there's no order in those categories. So things like ethnicity, race, marital status, religion are all examples of categorical variables that don't have any order. You can assign numbers to those categories. But all you can do is think of those numbers as labels. All you can do is report the proportion of people who are married, the proportion of people who are of Hawaiian ancestry, the proportion of people who are a particular racial, religious group. On the other hand, if the categories have an order to them, like quality of life or stages of change, they're what we call ordinal measurements. The number we assign to the person not only reflects which category you're in, but it also reflects where that category falls in the order of those sets of categories. So the bigger the number you assign to a category, maybe the more extreme that category is representing in terms of some level of that underlying variable. So ordinal measurements reflect order, but not necessarily distance between those categories. Continuous measurements are measurements that reflect both order and distance. So examples of these different types of scales of things I just mentioned, they're summarized in the next table. Nominal measurements, the values you assign to categories are just labels. Examples are things like race, ethnicity, in the first slide we looked at, religion. The only way you can measure those outcomes is by reporting proportions. Ordinal measurements, the categories have an order to them. The numbers you assign to those categories reflect that order. Things like body mass index class. So the classes were things like underweight, normal weight, overweight, obesity. They were assigned numbers 1, 2, 3, and 4 for the 4 different classes. The bigger the number, the more body mass index you have assigned to you, the heavier you are on that body mass index scale. The stages of change classes, remember Marjorie's example. The larger the number, the more you are along the spectrum of change, reflecting the stage you currently are at. But I put a question mark next to quality of life. Most quality of life instruments are really not treated as they're ordinal, are treated as if they were continuous, are treated as if the numbers you assign to a person reflect both order and distance. And the reason I mentioned the question mark here is let's go back to that slide where we first looked at that quality of life question. This is probably the most famous single question for measuring quality of life. Ask you to rate your quality of life on this 5-point scale. Excellent, very trying to get the pointer to work. Okay. Now here's a question to you, everybody. In your mind, imagine yourself having excellent health. Now in your mind, imagine yourself having very good health. Now imagining having good health, imagining having fair health, imagining having poor health. And the question I want to ask is when you change your mindset from excellent health to very good health, from very good to good, from good to fair to poor, did the step in terms of the amount of change in health remain the same? In other words, in your mind, if you considered excellent health as the highest amount of good health that you could have, and poor health as the worst, and I ask you to place along that spectrum of health, where very good health, and fair health, in those 5 states of health, the same, or is the distance different? So, for example, for anyone who thinks the distance is different, which of in terms of gaps between excellent and very good, or very good to good, or good to fair, or fair to poor, where do you think the gap is the narrowest? In other words, where the state of health are the closest together? You just send in, would you say it's between 5 and 4, 4 and 3, 3 and 2, and 2 and 1? Just send along in the chat if you want. Okay, I agree it's subjective. That's the important point here that I'm raising, is that it is subjective, and therefore does everyone agree in